It seems as though we have a very basic disagreement on the facts when we hear Liz Cheney talk about repeated overtures and Nick Burns arguing against the motion, saying that there has been no diplomacy. There is no diplomacy with Iran. And I want to kind of get to which is it? Has there been a lot of diplomacy? Have there been many efforts? Or has there been, Nick, you more or less said nothing. Respond to Liz's claim that there have been repeated overtures.
Well, I think I said that, since 1979-80, there have been lots of individual meetings. I think between Americans and Iranians, I think every administration has done that.
But why is that
there
not
have
diplomacy?
Been no, that's not diplomacy. That's not what we mean by diplomacy. There have been no sustained discussions on the nuclear issue, which is the most important issue. Take my example. I served in the Clinton administration, and I served in the Bush administration. In the Bush administration, I had the responsibility for trying to put those negotiations together. And we were not able to do that. We didn't meet with anybody. We didn't have extended discussions with the Iranians. We never got in the room with them in a meaningful way. That's what diplomacy is. It's actually trying to figure out what the other side is up to, what their bottom line is, seeing if it's right for us and smart for us to make a deal. And I just posed the following question based on that. If you're not for diplomacy now, and if you want to give up on diplomacy, which is the position of Liz and Dan, then what are you for? You can't say you're not for war, because you'll then leave President Obama with one option, to go to war. You'll have no credibility to go to sanctions, as Ken said. If we leave the diplomatic field right now, the Europeans, the Russians, and Chinese will not support us on sanctions. You're leaving President Obama with one choice: go to war. Third war for the United States of America in the Middle East.
Liz Cheney.
Well, I think first of all, Nick is mischaracterizing Dan's and my view on this. Dan and I are not arguing that we should abandon diplomacy or that we should not undertake diplomacy. Dan and I are simply arguing that the current diplomacy is going nowhere, and it's going nowhere because it's flawed diplomacy. Now, discussing this issue with Nick, I feel a little bit like Alice in Wonderland here, because Nick and I sat in many of the same meetings over the course of a number of years, and saying that we didn't have diplomacy because we didn't have sustained discussions completely ignores the fact that it was the Iranians who made that choice in many, many instances. And I went through in the beginning of the talk the extent to which the United States government has over 30 years attempted again and again and again, including our national security advisor sitting with the Iranian prime minister and saying, we will sell you weapons, we will recognize your country, we'll recognize your revolution. And the Iranians walk away from the table time and time again. Now, I think this gets to a very fundamental point that Dan made, which is what is Iran? What is the nature of that regime? And part of the problem with the current diplomacy, one of the reasons I believe it's going nowhere, is because there's a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of the regime. President Obama gives a Nehru's message to the Iranian people, but also to the regime, and he talks about things like common hopes and common dreams. I don't believe that we have any common hopes or dreams with the supreme leader in Iran. I don't. I think the supreme leader in Iran believes in exporting terrorism. He believes in exporting his Islamic revolution. And I think that, at the end of the day, you've got to ask yourself, as Kissinger was asked, is Iran a country or are they a cause? If Iran is a cause, if they are a hegemonic, revolutionary, terrorist, extremist power, and they're attempting to gain a nuclear weapon, then we are being dangerously naive and irresponsible to pretend that we have no history here of trying to talk to
Let me bring in the other side. Nick Burns.
It's important to note that this famous meeting that Liz has now cited twice took place 30 years ago, not exactly in modern times. I'd also say this in defense of President Obama. I'm impressed by him. I'm someone who's not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. I'm not a political person. I think he's actually outpointing the Iranians. He's put them on the defensive. That Nowruz message was not to the supreme leader. It was to the Iranian people. And I think it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense to stretch out a hand to the Iranian people over this chasm of 3 decades. What has President Obama done? The Nowruz message. He invited Iran to a UN conference on Afghanistan. He said that the United States, for the first time, would join these negotiations unconditionally, which I happen to think is the right thing to do right now, because our prior policy didn't work, with the Iranians. And so therefore, it's hard to argue that diplomacy is going nowhere when President Obama has taken baby steps to put us maybe into the first phase of diplomacy. I would submit that we've all got to give him at least 6 months to try diplomacy before we denounce it.
Dan, Senor.
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
I I just want to make one quick point, which is that our opponents need to decide what their position is. Their position is either diplomacy hasn't started, which is what they both argued when they made their opening presentation. It hasn't started, it's going to start this summer, give it some time. Or their position is, well, diplomacy has sort of started with some baby steps. Or their position has got to be, look, it started and the Iranians have actually responded well. They got to choose one of those. But I would say that at the end of the day, what we've seen actually is the administration has attempted to reach out a hand. The Iranians have not responded, and there's a report this afternoon out of the Jerusalem Post that the Iranians are actually basing missiles now along the Straits of Hormuz.
Ken Pollack, your opponent's calling for clarity on your position.
Yeah, look, I think that to say, have they started yet, are they just taking baby steps, it's a difference without real substance there. I think the point that we're trying to get at here, though, is that we don't really know what the Iranian position is. And more importantly still, the diplomacy is about more than just Iran. In fact, the most important objects of our diplomacy are, as Nick was suggesting, as I suggested, our European allies, our East Asian allies, the Russians, the Chinese, everyone else who is probably going to have to come on board before the Iranians realize that they've got to make a serious decision.
But isn't that diplomacy about Iran as opposed to diplomacy with Iran?
That's exactly, but both of them are interlocking, because the rest of the world is not interested in us only having diplomacy with them without also trying to engage the Iranians. That's what they want. That's the carrot for them. And in return, we're trying to get them to sign up for the stick.
Liz, can you come a little closer to the mic?
Yeah, I just want to, actually, it's not fair to say the rest of the world wants us to talk to Iran. I think that you've actually got a situation now, you saw it during the election, where you had the British, for example, demonstrate extreme nervousness with the notion that suddenly the United States was offering direct, unconditional talks, which is basically leaving our European allies aside. Our European allies have been with us in the European Union 3. We've been working on a multilateral course for diplomacy. Direct talks cuts them out of the picture. We haven't even talked about our Arab allies. And the notion that the Arab nations today want us to talk to Iran, is a fallacy. What we're hearing from government after government after government is that they are very nervous. They believe the United States is about to make deals with Iran, and so they are now thinking, do we need to make our own deals? Their concern is so great that we've sent our Secretary of Defense out to calm them down. So the idea that the rest of the world wants us to talk to Iran fundamentally mischaracterizes the danger of this new openness and this unconditional outreach.
Ken Pollack?
Disagreement here, and the fundamental disagreement
just to clarify, Nick Burns,
that I certainly have with Liz is that I spent most of my time between 2005 and 2008 shuttling to Paris and London and Moscow and Beijing on this question. Those partners of ours want us to have talks with Iran. They have accepted, I know they've accepted, that now we should do it unconditionally. When we conditioned in 2006 our entry into negotiations on Iran suspending its enrichment program, it gave the Iranians an excuse not to come to the table. Obama has taken away the excuse, which is one of the reasons why I'm impressed by his sophisticated diplomacy. And I can tell you for certain that the European allies agree with this and that they are ready to negotiate with us on that basis.
Dan Senor.
Nick, if the Americans have taken away the excuse, how long before the Iranians reciprocate? I mean, how long? You said 6 months. Are you giving 6 months for them to agree to come to the table? Or are you giving them 6 months once they agree to come to the table, then they have 6 months to figure out whether or not we can get a deal?
Ken and I are not arguing that diplomacy is a panacea. We're not naive. We know that diplomacy might not work, but if you try diplomacy and give it a shot, then it does strengthen us for what's ahead. What's ahead of us? Two major options to deal with Iran. One is to go back to very tough sanctions of the type that we haven't tried before because we haven't had the credibility to convince the rest of the world to do it. And finally, the use of force. And I've said we should leave the use of force, the threat of it, on the table. We should threaten sanctions, but you've got to go through this diplomatic process first to get to either of them. If you don't do that, you have no credibility.